It's 1927. Al Capone is the biggest gangster in Chicago, and he's looking to expand. He hops off a train on a frigid morning in Detroit with 3 bodyguards, and they check into a hotel. Al is in town to set up shop and take control of the millions of gallons of liquor passing through the city from Canada. He's got the muscle, the balls, and the reputation to do it, or so he thought. That same day, he receives a phone call in his hotel room. An hour later, 4 hard-faced men walk into the hotel and make their way to Al's room. The next morning, Al Capone is on the first train back to Chicago. He didn't achieve his goal, but he left with an agreement to get genuine Canadian whiskey from the men who decided who could and who could not move liquor in Detroit, the vicious group of killers known as the Purple Gang. Hey, you guys, gals, and bums, and welcome back to A Few Bad Men. All right, sorry for the wait, but here we are. All right, so we're going to start this video off by saying that the Purple Gang never existed. I mean, there was never a criminal organization that called themselves the Purple Gang. The name comes from the media, and its origins are hazy. Some say it came from the shop owners who said that the bad little kids who terrorized them were tainted or off color. They were purple like the color of bad meat. Some say it comes from the purple dye that the gangsters used to ruin fabrics during the Cleaners and Dyers War. Another comes from a police officer who described them to a reporter as working for a gangster named Ben Purple. He said, "They're Purple's gang." Whatever the reason, it was a catchy name and the media ran with it. They began to refer to the Jewish gangs in Detroit that controlled bootlegging, labor racketeering, gambling, and dope as the Purple Gang. The Purple Gang was similar to the Jewish mob in New York at the time. Different groups of Jewish gangsters with a common background working together for a common cause, money and power. Lepke and the Buggenmeyer mob and the Relish gang had so much crossover that they were pretty much the same gang with different factions. The same was for the Purples. The Purples consisted of the Oakland Sugar House gang run by Henry Shaw and Charlie Leiter, who supplied sugar to alcohol manufacturers, the Bernstein brothers and their group of hijackers, gamblers, and bootleggers, and the Little Jewish Navy, a group led by one-armed Mike Gelfand, who brought booze in from Canada across Lake Michigan in speedboats. Even though the members of these gangs hated the name and had no idea where it came from, they will forever be known as the Purple Gang. The gang that would be known as the Purple Gang was run by the Bernstein brothers. Abe Bernstein was born on January 5th, 1891 in New York City. He was the second child of Harry and Sarah Bernstein and the first of 4 boys. After the second boy, Joe, was born on December 20th in 1899, the family relocated to Detroit, where Raymond and Isidore were born in 03 and 06, respectively. The Bernstein boys grew up in the area known as Paradise Valley, that stretched from Jefferson Avenue to East Grand Boulevard on Detroit's Lower East Side. It was a mostly industrial neighborhood filled with factory workers, pushcart vendors, gamblers, and thieves. The family opened a small grocery store and lived in the apartment above. Abe spent most of his youth on the Lower East Side of New York, and by 10, he was already a street-savvy kid. When the family moved to Detroit, he dropped out of school and sold newspapers to help the family make ends meet. He eventually began working in gambling joints as a dealer and a stickman in crap games. On November 7th, 1916, police raided a pool hall owned by precinct boss Abe Ackerman. They found a craps game going on and arrested Abe and Paul Cotter for running the game. He was sentenced to 50 days in jail. Abe, being the oldest, was married by 1916, but his younger brothers were still of school age, and they were the badass little kids in the neighborhood. They were all placed in the Old Bishop School on Windsor Street. It was an ungraded school with 2 floors. 1 floor for the regular kids and 1 floor for the problem children. Joe, Raymond, and Isidore, known as Izzy, were placed on the 2nd floor with the bad kids. Being an ungraded school, the boys were in the same class with older boys. These older boys ran craps games after school, and the younger kids ran errands for them or acted as lookouts. The Bishop School would be the petri dish that spawned the Purple Gang. The Bernstein boys met several other boys just like them. Guys like the Fleischer brothers, Harry, Louis, and Sam. The Keywell brothers, Philip and Harry. Morris Rader, Harry Altman, Irvin Shapiro, Ben Purple, and many others. This would be the nucleus of the Purple Gang. As the boys got older, they began to run the craps games after school. They also began to terrorize local shops and residents and break into homes. The boys' time at the Bishop School gave them an education that would prepare them for their future. In 1918, Michigan became patient zero in America's social experiment known as prohibition. Michigan went dry 2 years before the rest of the country, and Detroit had no shortage of criminals who realized that they were in a position to get rich. Detroit is situated right across Lake Claire and Lake Erie from Canada, a country where booze was legal. Soon, every man with a boat became a bootlegger. They brought in whiskey by the caseload and sold it for 3 to 4 times what they paid for. In the winter, the lakes froze over and caravans of trucks would make the trip across the lake and return filled with cases of booze, sometimes several times a day. There were thousands of thirsty customers, and speakeasies known in Detroit as Blind Pigs popped up everywhere. The Purples took a predatory approach to bootlegging. All the liquor that they sold was stolen from others. They were known for extreme brutality when hijacking shipments, and they often shot the drivers during the attack just because. Abe by now was making money in gambling, and he took a role as an overseer of the gang. In the early 20s, Raymond Bernstein opened up a Blind Pig, his first of many, and the gang had established its reputation as being savage killers. It was around this time that the young Purples teamed up with an older group of gangsters known as the Oakland Sugar House Gang. The older gangsters began to use the Purples to help them eliminate competition in the sugar business, as well as protect the many liquor manufacturing plants that they operated around the Detroit area. The partnership started when the older Sugar House gangsters started having problems with some Italian gangsters. A guy named Frank Speed was part of an extortion ring. Originally from New York, he moved to Detroit around 1920 and had just come home from doing a 2.5-year bid for armed robbery. He was in a gang of Italians run by Louis the Wop, not to be confused with Louis the Wop Fabrizio from Brooklyn. They were involved in dog racing, and their scam was to pressure illegal businessmen to buy racing tickets. If they didn't, they would threaten them until they paid or things got violent. The Oakland Sugar House was a legitimate business. It wasn't illegal to sell sugar. What you did with it after you bought it was not their concern. Frank Speed and a few guys walked into the Oakland Sugar House one day and told Sugar House member Isidore Cantor to purchase $200 in racing tickets. Isidore was no fool, and he knew what was going on, and he told Speed to beat it. A few days later, Isidore and fellow Sugar House member George Goldberg were told that they were marked for death. On July 11, 1923, Isidore Cantor was walking near Hendry and Hastings Streets when a car came screeching to a halt. Isidore saw Frank Speed stepping off the running board with his hand in his pocket and walking aggressively. Isidore reached for his gun and shots rang out. Isidore put 5 bullets in the Speed before he ever got his hand out of his pocket. In front of hundreds of witnesses, he calmly put his hand back into his pocket and walked around the corner to the police station where he turned himself in. He said he shot Speed in self-defense. Speed would later die in the hospital, and Isidore Cantor would be found to be acting in self-defense, and the charges of murder were dropped. But the streets handled justice a little differently. Cantor continued to receive death threats. That September, Isidore Cantor was standing in front of a restaurant next to the Sugar House talking to a man named Saul Conrad and 3 women. A maroon touring car pulled up and stopped. The men in the car paused for a moment. Isidore was peering into the car when shots rang out. 5 men inside the vehicle unloaded automatic handguns before peeling off. Isidore Cantor was shot in the leg. All 3 of the women were grazed by bullets, but were okay. But 23-year-old Saul Conrad would be struck by a bullet in the leg, and he would bleed out before he reached the hospital. At the hospital, Isidore named Dominic Farrow and Charles Barone as the shooters. The Speed Gang offered Cantor $5,000 not to testify and leave town. Isidore took the money, and when it was time for trial, he could not be found. On April 12, 1924, George Goldberg and the 17-year-old driver were on Owen Avenue when a car pulled alongside and shots rang out. George would make it out without a scratch, but the 17-year-old Samuel Jacobs would not be so lucky. He would be hit several times and died on the spot. Several days later, on the 18th, the bullet-riddled body of Isidore Cantor would be fished out of the East River in New York, and the murder case against Dominic Farrow and Charles Barone went away. But Isidore Cantor was just a front man for the Sugar House Gang. Henry Shaw and Charles Leiter were the real powers, and they hired the younger Purples to protect their interests from the Italian gangs looking to muscle in. Soon, the Purples expanded from muscle to businessmen. They opened a few more Blind Pigs, as well as a few illegal casinos. And Joe began to muscle in on the bookmaking racket. But their main money earner was still booze. They had the real deal. Once they joined with the Little Jewish Navy, they began bringing in enough booze to keep the Midwest wet. They would bring the liquor in, cut it, and sell it to the many Blind Pig operators in the city. But for guys like Al Capone, he got the genuine article. And they had a never-ending supply of Al's favorite Old Log Cabin whiskey. But they were not yet above taking booze from others. and they needed a man to distribute the booze that they hijacked. They found that man in Johnny Reed. Johnny Reed was from St. Louis, and he was a veteran of the Egan's Rats. He made the move to Detroit, where he became a bootlegger and a kidnapper. He would be arrested in 1919 and charged with murder. Johnny and a returned World War I veteran named James Devlin were having issues over a woman. On Friday, February 7, 1919, Devlin was leaving the Morgan House Hotel at Cass and Bagley Streets around 10:30 p.m. He only got a few steps away from the doorway before two men jumped from the shadows and shots rang out. Devlin was shot in the face several times, and the two killers disappeared into the night. Reed was brought in and charged with murder, but was released due to lack of evidence. But Johnny was on the wrong side of the gun in May of 1921. He was in New York visiting actress Mrs. Hazel Warner. Johnny was shot 5 times by a gambler named Don Collins in her living room, and jealousy seemed to be the motive. Johnny recovered, and he returned to Detroit without the use of his left eye. He had a few blind pigs, a bookmaking joint, and he ran a kidnapping ring with his old Egan's Rats pals. He began to surround himself with some of the young tough purples, like Eddie Fletcher and Abe Axel. Both had cut their teeth in New York before moving to Detroit. Fletcher was a former boxer and tough guy, and Axel was one of those badass little kids. He was arrested almost a dozen times in New York before making the move and becoming muscle for the Purples. They were called the Siamese Twins, and they were responsible for a lot of people residing in the cemetery. Fletcher became Reed's personal bodyguard and driver. Detroit in the 20s was full of wolves. One of those wolves was Mike DePisa, a Chicago transplant who moved to Detroit in 1923 and quickly became a pain in the ass for the underworld. Mike was a shakedown artist, and Detroit had more than its share of men who made a lot of money and had no interest in involving the police in their business. Mike DePisa made a lot of enemies and became one of Detroit's most shot-at gangsters. In June of 23, him and 2 men robbed a big-time bookmaker named Jacob Big Jake Fricker of $3,000 and a diamond stick pen worth another $4,000. The next day, Mike DePisa was shot at on several different occasions as he drove through Detroit. Mike got the message and returned the money and a stick pen. It got to the point where no one wanted to stand on the street with Mike DePisa. Mike DePisa was a hard learner, and he set his sights on Johnny Reed. Johnny had just beaten a bank robbery case in Canada and was back on the streets. DePisa sent 2 of his men into Johnny's blind pig, and they told him that Mike DePisa wanted a cut of his business, and they dared him to do something about it. Johnny told the pair to take a long walk off a short pier, and then he did something about it. He made a call to his Egan's Rats pals in St. Louis. The next day, Fred Killer Burke, Milford Jones, and 6 other rats were in Detroit. They rode around looking for Mike DePisa at all his usual hangouts. When they spotted DePisa, they pulled alongside his car and shots rang out. Fred Burke's submachine gun peppered DePisa's car and it swerved and crashed into a parked car. A policeman witnessed the shooting and found DePisa and 2 of his men in the car, shaken but unharmed. Mike DePisa called for peace, and a truce was agreed upon. But Mike DePisa was a snake. He hired Chicago gunman Frank the Pollock Wright to end the feud. On December 26, 1926, Johnny Reed was returning from his apartment at 4:30 a.m. As soon as he pulled his car around back, a man stepped from the shadows and shots rang out. One blast from a sawed-off shotgun ended Johnny's life immediately. The Purples found out who was responsible for Reed's murder and set out to get even for their pal. On the morning of March 28, 1927, Frank Wright received a phone call. The man on the other end said that they had his pal, Meyer Fish Bloomberg, and they instructed him to go to the Miller Flores apartments to negotiate his release. Frank smelled a rat, so he brought 2 pals along. Frank Wright, Reuben Cohen, and Joseph Bloom arrived at the Miller Flores apartment building at 4:30 a.m. and walked to room 308. Before they could knock on the door, the fire door at the end of the hallway slid open and shots rang out. Fred Burke wielding the Thompson submachine gun and Abe Axel and Eddie Fletcher with automatic handguns fired on the trio and left them in a bloody heap before escaping out the rear of the building. Fred Burke would leave town, and Eddie Fletcher and Abe Axel were arrested but released due to lack of evidence. Mike DePisa escaped death until June 27, 1928. On that day, a tough guy named August Nykel was parking his car in front of his saloon at 8824 Jefferson Avenue when he bumped into the car of Mike DePisa pal, James Zanetti. The two got into an argument, and August Nykel slapped Zanetti across the face and told him to tell his friends that Gus Nykel hit you. Then he walked into his bar. 15 minutes later, Zanetti came back. This time he was with Mike DePisa, and they entered the saloon and told Nykel to come outside. Harsh words were exchanged, and then shots rang out. A gun battle between DePisa and Nykel resulted in Nykel being killed. But DePisa didn't get a chance to celebrate. A police officer witnessed the shooting and opened fire. DePisa shot back, wounding the officer, but was hit in the head and died on the spot. In 1926, Vivian Welsh and his new bride moved from Mississippi to Detroit, and he joined the police force. As a rookie, he was teamed up with veteran officer Max Weissman. Weissman was one of those cops who preyed on criminals, and he would demand money from blind pig operators with the threat of a police raid. Late in 27, Weissman resigned after a few gangsters complained. He took the background role, and Vivian took over the day-to-day and made the pickups. But the pair got greedy and began to demand more money. On January 31st, 1928, neighbors in Hamtramck, Michigan, right outside of Detroit, heard a car screech to a stop. They saw a man who was thrown, fell, or ran from a car. He got a few feet before shots rang out. Two men chased him down and shot him 9 times before returning to their car and speeding off. Welsh was found in his plain clothes, dead in the gutter. The police didn't have a motive, but they brought Weissman in and he was questioned. Several other people were questioned, including Raymond Bernstein, but in the end, the authorities believed it would be better just to let the incident fade away. No one was ever tried for the death of Officer Vivian Welsh. In the 1920s, before people had washing machines in their homes, the cleaning of clothes was big business. Wholesale plants would handle all the cleaning and dyeing for tailor shops and retail stores. In 1924, a price war between wholesalers was bringing down the prices so low that it was hurting everyone. In 1925, a man named Ben Abrams was brought in to get things in order. Abrams was a union racketeer from Chicago, and for a fee, he would organize the factories into a cartel that controlled the price and allowed everyone to make money. Once everything was set, Abrams named Charles Jacoby as the president of the Wholesale Cleaners and Dyers Association. Jacoby was married to the Bernstein sister, Eva. But that fact was kept under wraps so the Bernsteins would not be publicly associated with the union. The union quickly doubled the prices, and when retailers complained, they learned the hard way what they were dealing with. The younger Purples were brought in to keep everyone in line, and they began to put pressure on the independent cleaners and retailers that refused to work for them. By October 25, 80 cleaning establishments were stink-bombed. In 1 week alone in October, 9 establishments were stink-bombed and 2 were blown up. A few months later, an association meeting was called. The Purples showed up with their guns and let everybody know that the prices were going up. No one protested. For a little over 2 years, the Purples had the industry petrified. By 1927, Abe Bernstein was no longer in the background. Jacoby resigned and Abe took over. With Abe in charge, the prices doubled. At one of the weekly meetings, a shop owner asked why he was paying fees and what did they go to. He was told that he was paying to keep the Purples from bombing his place. In early 1928, several retailers complained to Samuel Polikoff, the vice president of the union. They had a vote and voted Abe Bernstein out as president. On March 22, 1928, Sam Polikoff was found slumped behind the wheel of his car. This terrified the members of the union, who were all legitimate businessmen. When questioned by police on the Polikoff murder, they began to talk. Charles Jacoby, Abe Bernstein, and 11 Purples were arrested, including Abe Axler, Raymond Bernstein, Irvin Shapiro, and Eddie Fletcher. They were charged with union racketeering and extortion. On September 13, 1928, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty. In 1929, Abe Axler, Eddie Fletcher, Harry Sutton, and Irvin Milberg were found guilty of violating the Volstead Act and were sentenced to 22 months in jail. In October of the same year, an internal dispute led to the death of 3 Purples. 25-year-old Irvin Shapiro, a longtime Purple, was involved in a kidnapping that was supposed to bring in 25 grand. The gang could only squeeze 4 grand out of the victim, and Shapiro wasn't happy about splitting 4 grand 5 ways. So he told his partners that if he didn't get his money, someone was gonna die. Shapiro was one of those Purple originals. He came up with the Bernsteins at the old Bishop School. He was a stone killer and an extortionist, demanding that blind pigs pay him 50% of their earnings to operate. But his tough guy act didn't work on his pals. At 3 a.m. on July 27th, hours after his threats, he was riding in the car with 4 other men. When the car was in front of 2464 Taylor Avenue, shots rang out. Someone in the backseat put 2 slugs in the back of Irvin Shapiro's head and another in his back. Neighbors heard the shots and saw a man lying in the gutter and a large gray touring car speeding off. 5 Purples were arrested for the murder. Sam Bernstein, not related, Harry Altman, Earl Passman, Sam Rosenberg, and William Weisberg, but they were released. On August 27th, a pal of Irvin Shapiro named Jack Eisenberg was sitting in his car in front of his home at 7715 12th Street. when a car pulled up and shots rang out. Eisenberg was found still behind his wheel, dead from multiple gunshots. On October 27th, longtime Shapiro associate Zygmunt Ziggy Selbin was walking down the street when two men approached him. Ziggy picked the wrong day to forget his gun. He recognized the men and tried to run. When they caught up to him, he was cowering in the doorway of a store. As he pleaded for his life, one of the men raised a gun and calmly put a bullet in his head before walking off just as calm. On the morning of January 2nd, 1928, Police Inspector Henry Garvin was on his way to work. Garvin was a 16-year veteran of the force, and in 1927, he was named head of the Crime and Bomb Squad, which was formed to put an end to the Purple's campaign of terror in the Cleaners and Dyers War. Since then, he had received 11 meritorious mentions and 5 citations for distinguished service. But Garvin was not on the up and up. When Ray Bernstein was arrested a few months earlier for gun possession by 2 of his men, Garvin ordered the men to change the police report and say that the guns were not found on Ray, but on the ground near him. He said that the orders came directly from the mayor and the charges were dropped. As Garvin pulled into the street that morning, a large black car pulled up quickly behind him and honked his horn. Garvin pulled over to let the car pass, and as the car came alongside his, shots rang out. Garvin heard the crack of a pistol and then felt a burning pain in the back of his neck. He fell to the floor of his car. The shooters then pumped 11 more rounds into the car before pulling off, believing that their mission was accomplished. But Garvin was not dead. The shaken officer stayed on the floor of the car until other officers showed up on the scene. He had been shot 4 times, but none of his injuries were life-threatening. But 9-year-old Lois Bartlett, who was on her way to school that morning, was not so lucky. She was hit by stray bullets, once in the back, twice in the arm, and once in the head. She was taken to Receiving Hospital in critical condition. Doctors were doubtful she would make it, but Lil Lois was tougher than any gangster's bullets, and she would eventually make a full recovery and have a story to tell her grandkids. Nothing lasts forever, and no gang can stay on top. Eventually, rivals or the law will knock you off your spot. But the demise of the Purples came from within. Joe Bernstein had spent the 20s making his bones. He was arrested 13 times between 1919 and 1929 for disorderly conduct, weapons possession, assault, and gambling. He was known as the Bernstein brother with the shortest temper. By 1930, Joe Bernstein was the leader of the Purples. He controlled the wire services that brought in the race results from around the country for off-track horse racing. He used his money to build a big house in Detroit and one in Florida to get away from the bitter Detroit winters. He used his purple muscle to gain control over the bookmaking rackets, and he chose Harry Kirschenbaum to oversee the operation. But Harry had a weakness for the opium pipe, and he would go on binges for weeks, neglecting his bookmaking duties. Joe and Harry had been friends since Harry came out to Detroit from New York in '24 after a lengthy criminal career. On May 7th, Joe found out that Harry wasn't handling his business, and he came to his house at 4011 Cortlandt Avenue. Harry's wife let him in. Joe smelled the pungent odor of opium in the air and asked, "Where is he?" His wife said that Harry had been on the bench for weeks. Joe said, "Don't worry, I'll straighten him out." Joe took off his jacket and rolled up his sleeves and made his way up the 3 flights to the attic, ready to give his old pal the tough love that he needed. But when Joe kicked in the door, Harry grabbed his gun and shots rang out. Harry shot Joe in the abdomen. Joe ran back down the 3 flights and out the back door. Harry chased him through the alley, firing shots at his old friend. When his gun jammed, he tossed it into the bushes, and then he went to his car where he had another gun and followed Joe down the street. A man named George Barrett saw Harry toss the gun and decided to play hero. He grabbed the gun from the bushes and hopped on a passerby's running board and told him to follow Harry. Harry noticed the tail and shot through his own rear window and hit Barrett twice in the chest. When that gun was empty, Harry sped off. His car would be found a few blocks away. Joe was taken to the hospital where the doctors repaired his spleen. He refused to tell the cops what took place. The cops followed the trail of blood to Harry's house where they found pounds of opium, cash, guns, and 1 opium pipe filled and still warm. Harry would be arrested in Los Angeles a few weeks later. When Joe did not name him as his killer, he would be found not guilty. Barrett would sue Joe Bernstein for his hospital bills. Joe would settle out of court with an envelope of crisp $100 bills. Joe and Barrett would both make recoveries, but Joe was done with the street stuff. He took his wife and his family and moved to California, and the youngest brother, Izzy, went with him. With Joe and Izzy in L.A., and Abe spending his time in Florida after the Cleaners and Dyers trial, that left Raymond as the senior Bernstein on the Purples. But he wasn't alone. The Keywell brothers and the Fleischer brothers, as well as Harry Altman and Harry Millman, a relatively new member but already a stone killer, was still around. A chance encounter on September 23, 1930, would remove another Purple from the streets. On that evening, a 17-year-old black kid named Arthur Mixon was driving a horse-drawn cart down an alley. He was with two of his friends selling ice to residents trying to escape the heat on Hastings Street. The boys heard a noise coming from what appeared to be an abandoned barn. The curious teens went to investigate. What they stumbled on was the Purple's alcohol cutting plant. Philip Keywell, Morris Rader, and Harry Millman were working their magic on a shipment of bourbon. The boys decided that it would be best to leave, but they were noticed by Rader and Keywell. The pair followed the teens out into the alley and asked them what they were doing. When Mixon gave a smart reply, Rader told Keywell to put him on the spot. Philip Keywell pulled his piece and shots rang out. Keywell shot Mixon 4 times in the back as he tried to run away. He would die on the spot. Keywell and Rader would be arrested, and this time the witnesses were not afraid to testify. In October 1930, Philip Keywell would become the first Purple to be found guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Over the next few years, the Purples would continue their self-destructive ways. The next to go was Earl Passman. Passman was involved in bookmaking as well as bootlegging. On July 22, 1931, Passman was in an apartment along with Harry Altman and Harry Pont, drinking, laughing, and taking booze orders over the phone. At some point, an intoxicated Altman got up to leave. He mistook the closet door for the front door and walked in. Seeing the opportunity to put one over on his pal, Earl Passman jumped up and slammed the door behind Altman, trapping him in the closet. Pont joined him at the door, and the two kept Altman from opening. Altman yelled out that if they didn't let him out, he would shoot his way out. Passman and Pont laughed and kept the pressure on the door. Then the practical joke went left when shots rang out. Altman fired through the door and struck Passman in the chest. The apartment was filled with booze, so Pont and Altman decided to take Passman out to the alley. When the police arrived, they found Passman dying in the arms of Pont on the sidewalk. He told them that a car drove by and shot Passman. Passman would not make it to the hospital alive. Harry Altman would eventually be arrested, but was released due to lack of evidence. Isidore Sutka, Joseph Leibowitz, and Herman Paul were originally from Chicago. They were bootleggers and extortionists. After trying to shake down a few speaks under Capone's protection, they were given an option to leave town or leave a will. They chose to head to Detroit. There they became involved with the Little Jewish Navy. They were introduced to the Purples through Saul Levine. Levine went all the way back to the Bishop School with Joan Raymond. Sutka, Leibowitz, and Paul were given an area in Detroit, and they controlled the booze and gambling in that area and paid the Purples for the right to do so. But greed would not allow them to operate square. They would hijack loads of Purple booze meant for others and sell it to the Italian gangs throughout Detroit. Several of their men were killed by Purples, and the trio were warned to cut it out or join their comrades. The last 2 straws came when Ray Bernstein found out that the trio were trying to go behind his back and sell booze directly to Al Capone in Chicago. The next one came when they got a shipment of booze on credit from the Purples and were late paying them back. Sutka reached out to Raymond and asked for more time. A big convention was coming into town, and he would be able to make his money back there. Ray sent a message through Saul Levine. Ray told him he wanted to give Saul and the trio their own operation, and the meeting was set up. Ray told Saul Levine to bring the trio to the Collingwood Apartments at 1740 Collingwood Avenue. On September 16, 1931, Saul Levine, Joe Leibowitz, Herman Paul, and Isidore Sutka walked into the Collingwood Apartments. They were met by Ray Bernstein in the lobby, and they followed him up to apartment 211. When they entered, they found Harry Fleischer, Harry Keywell, and Irvin Milburn. The two groups shook hands, and Levine, Paul, Sutka, and Leibowitz sat on the couch while the Purples grabbed chairs from the kitchen and sat across from them. Ray laid out the plan. He would let them operate independently, but first they needed to pay back the debt with interest. Ray said he didn't know how much that would come up to off his head, but his accountant would know. Harry said, "Why don't you go down to the drugstore and give him a call?" Ray got up and walked down the back steps to the alley where his car was parked. Ray started his car and began to gun the engine, causing the engine to backfire. At the same time, he started honking on the horn. Back in the apartment, the Purples heard the backfire. That was the signal. Harry Fleischer jumped up, pulled a pistol, and shots rang out. Fleischer sent a bullet whizzing past Saul Levine's nose, hitting Joe Leibowitz. Keywell and Milberg both jumped up. Keywell shot Sutka while Milberg shot Paul in the back as he tried to run. Saul Levine sat frozen in fear as his pals were slaughtered right in front of him. Ray Bernstein had given the word that his old pal was not to be harmed. The Purples dumped their pistols into a bucket of green paint in the kitchen and took off down the back stairs. The Purples and Saul Levine piled into Ray Bernstein's car and he pulled off. Saul Levine would be dropped off a few blocks later and given cab fare. But Ray Bernstein asked him, "We're friends, right?" "Sure we are," Saul said. "All right then," Ray said, before pulling off. Saul Levine would be the number one suspect. He was arrested along with Ray Bernstein, Irvin Milberg, and Harry Keywell. Harry Fleischer had taken off after the killing. Levine told the police that he had dropped the doomed men off at the Collingwood and drove away. But he eventually folded after the DA threatened to charge him with the killings. Saul Levine would take the stand against his old pals. His testimony, along with a dozen witnesses who saw the men fleeing, sealed their fate. It only took the jury a little over an hour to find the men guilty. Irvin Milberg, Harry Keywell, and Raymond Bernstein were sentenced to life in prison. A year later, Harry Fleischer would walk into a Detroit police station and surrender. He was charged with the Collingwood murder, but he was found not guilty after Saul Levine, who was now living in Oklahoma City, went on the run and refused to testify. By 1932, Abe Axler and Eddie Fletcher were back on the streets after 2 years. They returned to a new Detroit. The citizens were growing tired of the constant violence, so Detroit, like a lot of big cities at the time, enacted laws that prevented known criminals from associating with one another. Axler and Fletcher were often picked up by police and charged with breaking this new law. The winds of the underworld were changing too. The Jewish rackets were being taken over by the Italian gangsters. But the Purples had ruled Detroit for a long time, and their reputation was well established. So instead of going to war with the Purples, the Detroit mob, run by Pete Licavoli, bought Abe Bernstein out. Abe took his money and was now living full-time in Florida. Axler and Fletcher tried to go legit. Fletcher, a former boxer, returned to the sport as a manager, but nothing paid like being a gangster. Soon they were back at their old ways. But by 1933, they were in hot water with someone. Being users themselves, they tried to muscle in on the city's lucrative dope racket. This didn't sit well with other Purples who controlled that racket. The pair began to receive death threats, and they began to move separately to make it harder to get them both at the same time. But on November 26, 1933, the pair let their guard down and were seen drinking together at a bar. Witnesses saw them leaving the bar and get into a car with two other men. A few hours later, at around 1:45 a.m., a police officer came across the car on the wrong side of the road in Bloomfield County, running with its lights on. Upon inspection, he found the bodies of Abe Axler and Eddie Fletcher. Both men had been shot multiple times at close range in the head and chest. In an added show of disrespect, the killers had placed the two men's hands together as if they were holding hands. The bodies would be returned to New York for burial. Prohibition was repealed in 1933, but there was still money to be made in producing booze and not paying taxes on it. So the Fleischer brothers continued to sell cut alcohol. In 1934, they had competition. But this was no ordinary criminal. This was Henry Shaw, one of the leaders of the Sugar House Gang, and the Fleischer's mentor. Shaw started his own business selling cut booze, but he may have sealed his fate when he testified before a grand jury on an alcohol cutting ring. On December 1st, 1935, Shaw left his house and was never seen again. 2 days later, Shaw still had not been reported missing. Harry Fleischer was pulled over and an officer noticed blood on the upholstery of his back seat. When he was asked about it, Harry told the police that he had slapped a woman and it was a bleeding nose that made the stain. A week later, Shaw's wife reported him missing. Harry Fleischer volunteered to bring his car in so the police could inspect it. But Harry had had the car reupholstered since then, and the car was clean. The body of Henry Shaw was never found. In 1936, two of the Fleischers were arrested after a still they ran was discovered by federal agents in April. Harry and his brother Louis and Jack Selbin were sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and fined $20,000 each for operating an illegal still and not paying taxes. The Purples were all but done for. Sam Fleischer had been sent away months before his brothers on the hijacking case. Axler and Fletcher were gone. 2 Keywells and 1 Bernstein brother were in jail for life. The other 3 Bernsteins were in retirement. The only Purple with any power left was Harry Millman. It was Harry Millman who was supposedly responsible for the demise of Abe Axler and Eddie Fletcher back in 1933. Harry was younger than the original Purples. He joined around 1928 as a teen, but he quickly made his way in the underworld through violence. Harry was an abusive and violent drunk. The problem was worse because he was seldom sober. More importantly, Harry hated the Italian gangsters who now ran Detroit. He made it his point to rob their places and extort money from mafia-protected businesses. Several times, Abe Bernstein had to have talks with the young hoodlum, but to no avail. He kept on spitting in the face of the mafia, literally. In 1936, he walked into a barbershop while Joe Scarface Bomarito was getting his shave. Harry pulled the towel off of Joe's face and spat in it. The two got into a brawl and Harry was kicked out. Joe Bomarito was the brother-in-law of boss Pete Licavoli. Up until this point, the relationship between Abe Bernstein and the mafia was keeping Harry alive. Licavoli told Abe that Harry had to go, and Abe gave his okay. Harry Millman knew he was on the spot, but he was not hiding. He went off to be at his usual hangouts, drinking well into the night. On August 29, 1937, Harry parked his brand new LaSalle coupe in the garage on Lafayette Boulevard and went into the 1040 Club. He was accompanied by the wife of imprisoned Purple member Harry Fleischer, but that's none of my business. They sat and ate for hours before he called her a cab and sent her home. He stayed at the 1040 and continued to drink with his pals. In the early hours on the 30th, he handed his keys to the doorman, a black man named William Holmes, and asked him to bring the car around. Harry walked out and stood on the curb, laughing while he waited for Williams to bring the car. When William Holmes turned the key, the car exploded. 10 sticks of dynamite stuffed into the engine detonated, sending William flying halfway out the back window and severing both his legs. The explosion twisted the V8 engine and blew the hood of the car 4 stories onto the garage roof. Harry heard the explosion, and once he realized what was going on, he got out of there. Holmes died shortly after he reached the hospital. Harry remained on the spot, and he still didn't care. On Thanksgiving Eve, November 24th, 1937, Harry Millman was at Boski's Delicatessen at 12th and Hazelwood, drinking with his friends, Harry Gross and Jaime Cooper. Around 1 a.m., Harry got up from the table and went to the bar and ordered another drink. At the same time, 2 hard-faced men with fedoras pulled down over their eyes entered the restaurant and shouldered their way to the back. As Harry was reaching for his drink, shots rang out. 2 shooters opened up on Harry from less than a foot away with .45 automatics. One caught Harry in the spine and he dropped to the ground. The killer stood over him and pumped 9 more bullets into him, including 2 to the chest and 1 to the forehead. They then turned their guns on Cooper and Gross, wounding both of them. As the killers made their escape, a man was coming out of the bathroom and he was shot for being in the way. The killers jumped into a car with Michigan plates and took off. We know now that the shooters were Harry Happy Mayone and Pittsburgh Phil Strauss of Brooklyn's Murder Incorporated. The death of Harry Millman marked the end of the Purple's 2-decade-long reign as Detroit's toughest gang. Joe, Abe, and Izzy Bernstein would remain retired from the rackets, and Raymond would spend 30 years in jail along with Harry Keywell for the Collingwood Massacre. He suffered a stroke and was paroled in 1964. He died in the hospital on July 9, 1966, at the age of 61. Abe would be found dead in his hotel in Florida of a heart attack in 1968 at 75. Izzy would die in 1969, and Joe would live until 1984 when he died of a heart attack. Both Keywell brothers would eventually be released and would die peaceful deaths, as would the Flashers. And that, my friends, is the skinny on the Purple Gang. I hope you guys enjoyed the story as much as I enjoyed telling it. I hope you learned some things about these guys you didn't know. I'm sorry it took so long. There was a lot of info to sift through, a lot of people, a lot of names, a lot of Harrys and Henrys. So I just wanted to do this one as a full video. I didn't want to break it up, and so that's why it took so long. All right. I want to thank all the people who joined the gang and became members to the Patreon and gave donations to the channel. I really appreciate that. Not just the money, the love and appreciation I get from you guys. It pushes me to go harder and dig as deep as possible into these bad men's lives and get these videos as good as I can make them. So if you're new here and you like what we're doing, you need to bump off that subscribe button. All right. That lets us know you're serious. Okay. Then break that thumb, ring that bell, and set it for all notifications so you don't miss nothing. All right, if you want to help the channel run smooth, you can become a member for $1.99 a month. That's chump change. All right, or you can join the Patreon channel. There you can get the versions of the videos with the images I can't show you on YouTube. And this episode definitely has images that I can't show you on YouTube. So if you want to see them, you got to go over there and sign up. All right, I've talked enough. So this has been A Few Bad Men. Keep your nose clean and don't take any wooden nickels. I see yous in the funnies.